You are in the gun with Schuyler, Callihan, and the signal caller, Jed Drenning. It is part two of our Big 12 season preview. We've got seven more to go through here. Really only six because we're going to kind of fly through the West Virginia one at the end because, well, Jed, Owen, and Wesley Euler, they did a really good job of breaking down the offense and defense in a very in-depth preview for that. So if you want to catch those episodes, make sure to go to YouTube and believe.com as well to find those out. Before we get into starting here with Oklahoma, a quick word from Bet Online. Bet Online is your number one source for all your betting needs. Get the latest odds, lines, and matchup reports for baseball, boxing, golf, and more. Bet Online continues to be the fastest and easiest way to place your wagers, including live betting and your favorite casino and card games available to play right now from your phone. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and get in on the action. Remember to use the promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for your 50% welcome bonus for your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts. And Jed, where we start is the Oklahoma Sooners. 6-7, their first losing season, as we just researched, their first losing season since 1998, and it sure as hell feels. Seems like for the longest time they have just been at the top of the Big 12. They've dominated the conference. They've been in the national picture almost every single year. First year under Brent Venables, you kind of expected it to be a little bit of a step back. I don't know that Sooner fans thought it would be that dramatic, but the key thing that I noticed for them last year was one-score games. I think they had maybe 5 of their 7 losses. I can't remember off the top of my head. You may have that
Yeah,
number.
they love to talk about that.
Yeah, one-score games was their big bugaboo from last year. If they can get that fixed, I think they've got the talent in place to get things flipped around here pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I said, Oklahoma loves to tell you how many close games they lost last year. I mean, there used to be a metric in the Elias Baseball Almanac. I'm dating
Yep.
myself when I was growing up, and one of the metrics that was a key metric was what was a team's record in one-run baseball games? Because if you had a poor record in one-run games, you could be on the cusp of a turnaround the next year.
Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons Oklahoma likes to spend so much time telling you about all their close losses is because they're trying to distract you from how they imploded against TCU 55-24. They certainly don't want to talk about that Texas game 49-0. Neither of those games look very Oklahoma like. I mean, I've seen Oklahoma lose close games before, but I haven't seen them fall apart against those types of opponents to that extent, especially Texas. So interesting that you have an offensive oriented coach in Lincoln Riley leave. Now, if he had a shortcoming during his tenure at Oklahoma, first of all, there weren't many shortcomings with all the Big 12 titles that he had, but it was on the defensive side of the football. They couldn't solve things to the level they wanted to defensively. That always seemed to catch up with them in the college football playoff. So you hire a guy with a defensive pedigree in Brent Venables. And what plays out last year? An Oklahoma offense that was explosive, that scored with anyone, but once again struggled to stop people. So, I mean, this Oklahoma defense was ninth in the league in total defense, 10th in the league against the pass, ninth in the league against the run. They really struggled in just about every key area. They didn't tackle very well. They weren't fundamentally sound. Teams leaned on them in the second half. In other words, when you look at the yards per carry they allowed in the second half, it was 4.8 yards per rush. That was worse than the Big 12. So over the balance of a 16 a game, teams found ways, and the verdict was, or the jury was out on them. It was, here's the narrative: lean on them long enough, and they'll eventually, that dam's going to break, and it did. You saw it with the West Virginia game. I mean, that was kind of their season of microcosm. West Virginia leaned on them, had success on the ground in the second half, and won by what? A field goal, a walk-off field goal to end it. Oklahoma was on the short end of the business end of many of those types of games last year. So I do think that they have a trigger man in place that can lead them back to the promised land, or back towards the promised land, in Dylan Gabriel, an incredibly established kid. I mean, anytime you have 109 touchdowns over the course of your career, combination of UCF and last year at Oklahoma, he's played for Jeff Levy at multiple different stops. Jeff Levy is a creative play designer. I think he does a good job putting a plan together. So once again, the question is, can you help your defense starting on offense? Oklahoma, I go back to this so many times. How many snaps a game did that Oklahoma defense that was leaned on face? 80.2. Not only was it the most in the Big 12, it was the most out of the 14 teams that will occupy this year's Big 12, because this side ranked these stats this time. So that defense was on the field for 80 snaps a game. You don't typically see that with defensive oriented head coaches. So I have to think first they have to be looking to address that. One of the ways they hope to do so, part of it was execution, part of it was fundamentals, but part of it was a lack of talent. They did have an exodus. You can expect that during a coaching transition. So they tried to address that over the course of this offseason. Oklahoma brought in the 9th ranked transfer class, depending on where you're looking at it. But most importantly, they brought in 6 guys who were defensive starters at the Power 5 level, who can contribute to this defense and turn it around pretty quickly. So you have to think, if Brent Venables can put a plan together, he's not going to be doing this by himself. I mean, Ted Roof's a guy that he's very familiar with. Ted Roof's a good football coach. They got to get some of the right pieces in place and get a defensive strategy in place, but that defensive strategy has to be linked to the offensive strategy. They can't be asked to defend 80 slugs a game. They can't do it. So that's going to have to be mitigated. The offense will continue to grow. They're going to find weapons. They always have weapons. They even lost some last year and still found a way to score. But I don't care if it's Jalil Farouk. I don't care if it's, we talked about Stogner. I mean, they're always going to have guys that if you put them in space, they're going to find a way to catch the football, come down with it, make things happen. So Marcus Major, expect some solid things out of him in the run game. But Dylan Gabriel is a kid who can make this thing go. We saw him do it last year. I think he'll continue to do it this year. In part, their struggles came. I talked about those blowout losses. In fairness to Oklahoma, I do have to mention Dylan Gabriel was knocked around. Okay, so Dylan Gabriel didn't play the better part of those 2 losses. So he makes a difference for this football team. Once again, we've had this narrative with Kansas. We have this narrative with Oklahoma. Offensively, very functional. They can even be lead or exceptional, as you've seen in previous Oklahoma teams, but they have to find some answers on the defensive side of the football. If they will, we'll see.
Yeah, and moving to their rival. Well, I don't know if you can even call them that anymore now that they're going to be leaving to the SEC. This is going to be the last year of Bedlam, unfortunately. Thanks, conference realignment, for that one. But let's take a look here at Oklahoma State. Mike Gundy always seems to find a way to usher this team to 9-10 wins every now and then, and it seems like every time I say this is going to be the year Oklahoma State takes a step back, he ends up surpassing that expectation. But I can't, Jed, for the life of me, see a path, a road, a scenario in which this Oklahoma State team actually does that this year. I just the talent level is not what it has been at Oklahoma State. You think about the explosive offenses they've had. They've had really good quarterback play. They've had that true number 1 receiver for years. They've had really good running backs, whether it be Chuba Hubbard or Jalen Warren. They didn't run the football that well last year either. Where does Oklahoma State have to concentrate its efforts if it wants to even have a chance to be in this Big 12 picture?
It's an interesting situation. First of all, the portal hasn't been kind to them. I mean, at every turn, there's been attrition, right? So they've tried to address some of those needs of their own that were created by the portal by bringing kids into the portal. Alan Bowman, a quarterback. I mean, this is a kid that I remember as a young gunslinger at Texas Tech when we faced him. He left that game prematurely with a partially collapsed lung with the injury. I mean, he could flip it around, and that was he was on that streak where he had that 600-yard game as a true freshman against Houston, like one of the only 2 or 3 true freshmen in the history of the college game to do so, 600 plus yards. So he has potential. Then he transfers out of Texas Tech. He couldn't stay healthy. He ends up in Michigan, couldn't find the field there. So now Gundy's asking him to pull the trigger at Oklahoma State. And it's going to be interesting to see how things play out, see how things unfold. He needs to make some things happen, because I do think they'll find a way with Casey Dunn to have some playmakers on the perimeter. They always seem to do that. They're one of those programs that offensively just seem to have these big framed, large bodied guys with ball skills who get it done. But as you touched on, what's different, they've lacked that punch in the run game. And we haven't even talked about the absence of Spencer Sanders, who didn't have to leave but did, right? So the winningest quarterback, since Moby Dick was a guppy at Oklahoma State. And so here we go. On the offensive side, they have some questions. On the defensive side, they're trying to rebuild themselves. I mean, one of the few things they got right, they have a plan on third down defensively for the 3rd straight year. They led the Big 12 in defensive third down efficiency. But outside of that, they had some struggles. I mean, this is a team, it's hard to believe that Early last year, they were 5-0. They were in the top 10 in the country, and then things fell apart against TCU, and they blew that lead. And the next thing you know, they're struggling down the stretch, as we saw with West Virginia knocking them around with Jalen Anderson. So we'll see how things play out for them.
Yeah, Oklahoma State again. I see this being a year where they may struggle to get bowl eligible. I really do. I think it's going to be an uphill battle for them. Everything's going to have to go right. Alabama's going to have to play out of this world. He hasn't even won the job yet, but we kind of can all assume that that's going to be the case there. As Garrett Rangel, very young kid, they like him, but it's probably a better situation if they go with the experienced hand there. And as always, this episode of ITG is, of course, brought to you by our friends at Toothman Ford. We all know cars cost less in Grafton. And now we're going to move to the TCU Horned Frogs, who were the darlings of the Big 12 Conference a year ago. They came out of nowhere. No one expected anything in year one of the Sonny Dykes era, taking over for Gary Patterson. But it seemed like every button he pushed worked, and they hit lightning in a bottle. That's the term we've been using with them here the last couple of weeks, as they made their way all the way to the college football playoff. They won a game. They're in the national championship. But this is a team that has lost a ton of production, a very key spots. No more Quentin Johnston, no more Kendre Miller. You lose Max Duggan. The good thing is they do have Chandler Morris, who was actually their starting quarterback to begin the year last year. He is back. So they do have some pieces back from that team a year ago, and you saw some of those guys that were maybe in reserve roles get a taste of that. But there's going to be a lot of question marks about this TCU team heading into 2023.
Well, let's talk about what their recipe for success was last year. I mean, obviously, heading into this year, you hit on it, Schuyler. They have the least amount of returning production on the offensive side of the football in the entire Big 12. But not only that, you haven't even mentioned the loss of their play caller, their coordinator, who was critical, and Garrett Riley, who's off to Clemson. So a new offensive coordinator. People like to think that because of Sonny Dykes' pedigree, he's the architect of all things offensive with any team that he coaches, including TCU. But I'm telling you, Garrett Riley was pretty critical or central to their success offensively. So it's going to have to start with Chandler Morris. The good news is Chandler Morris actually won that job heading into last year. He got dinged up against Colorado, and that's what led to the legend of Max Duggan taking off. But so what TCU did a year ago, they came off one of the worst 4-year stretches that they'd had in a long time, in several decades, when Sonny Dykes came to town. They fired the guy whose statue was standing outside the stadium. So that's kind of the situation that he stepped into. Well, what he did was he hit the portal. Now, he hit the portal in such a way that was efficient through solid scouting. He wasn't outbidding the Blue Bloods to get some of these kids that he ended up getting that were such a critical part of their success. He got a center from SMU that played for him there. He got a backup tight end from Texas. He got a will linebacker from Navy. He got a cornerback from Louisiana Monroe, who, oh, by the way, West Virginia was very heavy after, and Josh Newton. And Josh Newton turns out to be an all-conference player. Every one of those guys that I just mentioned or alluded to, they all played a big role in what TCU did last year. So the question is, can he do the same thing? Is he one of the few guys that's mastered the modern era of the portal? Because you're almost going to have to do so if you're a non-blue blood, right? Well, right now, TCU, even again this offseason, is currently ranked with the best transfer class in the entire Big 12, and by many metrics, a top 15 national transfer class. I always talk about this when you look at the different rankings for these off-season production. How did you do in the portal? Well, different places evaluate it differently. On3.com is one of the places that attaches a value to how you did with your transfer class once the season winds down. Well, when you look at the 4 teams that were in the college football playoff last year, Georgia finished dead last in the Power 5 last year in transfer production. They didn't need any transfers. Now they're starting to get some. But Ohio State, another playoff team, 63rd in the Power 5. Michigan really didn't help or hurt themselves. They were 37th. The one playoff team that helped themselves because they necessarily had to was TCU, who ranked 10th. So they're pushing right in that same range right now. That's the type of thing that's going to happen. I mean, they're going to have to find some guys that help Chandler Morris out. You talked about the ridiculous loss of production they have on the offensive side of the football. this is almost to some extent going to have to become a more defensive oriented football team. So the question becomes, can Joe Gillespie's unit, with a lot of returning kids, step up, answer the bell, and play a more critical role for the success of TCU than they did a year ago? I mean, they're now in a position that anything short of a playoff appearance or a Big 12 championship, because they didn't win the Big 12 last year, but they got to the title game, but they did make the playoff. Short of one of those two things would be considered somewhat of a step backwards, right? So that's a good place to be. I mean, that's where you want to set the bar. That's where they're at. But they got a lot of answers to find on the offensive side of the football. And as they seek those answers, Sonny Dykes is a creative guy. I give him credit. He's from that creative air raid school. He's on the more creative branch of that air raid tree. So can he find similar answers with Chandler Morris? Again, when you talk about Chandler Morris, this kid's not a dud. I mean, a lot of folks might forget some of the production that he had before he got dinged up. He was offensive player of the week against Baylor in 21 with 461 yards. So the kid can fling it around. He understands their system. He understands Sonny Dykes' system, which he mastered last year, even as an injured kid. So I think there's a lot of potential with him. Will they find the other answers? Will they be able to run the football? But they're in the meantime, they're going to have to lean on their defense.
Now let's move on to the Texas Longhorns. And if you haven't been following the recruiting world lately, well, it's kind of hard not to with Texas, because they landed arguably the biggest name out there in recruiting history in Arch Manning. Probably not going to be seen much on the field this year as Quinn Ewers returns at starting quarterback, but Arch Manning going to be the future of that program moving forward. But Jed, I mean, this is a team that they lost Bijan Robinson, they lost Rashawn Johnson in the backfield, but they've got so much coming back. I mean, they've got the best receiver, in my opinion, in Xavier Worthy in the Big 12. And defensively, I think you can make a case they're one of the best defenses in the entire league. So this is a team that has the formula and really the nucleus to get to a Big 12 championship. It's just a matter of, can they overcome the adversity when it hits, because it's been a program that has not handled adversity well, regardless of who the head coach has been.
You're talking about Xavier Worthy as a weapon. They got a couple transfers that are going to help them that are weapons. Jatavius Sanders, I'm telling you, that dude, when he caught that leak route in front of our sidelines and starts slipping up in front, he's a man. I mean, that's a big human right there. So he might be the best tight end in the Big 12. So they got the best at a lot of spots in the Big 12. Now, that being said, let's first start with this. All those weapons they had, including Bijan. I mean, Bijan might have been the most dynamic player in all of college football last year. Look, if you're a fantasy football guy, which I no longer am, grab Bijan in your league, because he's going to be productive as a rookie in the NFL. I have no doubt about it. But okay, all that being said, Steve Sarkisian, offensive coach, offensive pedigree, all these toys, all these bells, all these whistles. How many plays do you think last year? This is a bit of a trivia question. I'll put you on the spot. How many pass plays, I should say, of 50 plus yards did Texas have last year?
Ooh, 50 plus. I want to go plus 4.
They were the only team in the Big 12 with 0.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's not that they always find a way to make the plays that you think they should. And here's the thing, they don't manage that. The culture's been the issue. I mean, Charlie Strong talked about this when he left. At Texas, if you sign a 5-star, that's often not enough. Where did that 5-star come from? They might have come from the wrong high school, because there's such a rip between the factions of boosters there that, oh, he's not even Lake Travis, we don't want him. That's not the kind of 5-star we want. I mean, can you imagine trying to manage that while you're also trying to beat quality football teams in the Big 12 moving into the SEC? So I'm not going to pity Sark, but that's what you're dealing with when you got. Now, you're often judged. This is his 3rd season. This is the time that the rubber hits the road at DKR. On the 40 acres, this is about the time that people start to really decide one way or the other. You might outlast your 3rd year, but oftentimes the decision's already made in your 3rd year. That might have been the case with Tom Herman, but he won that Sugar Bowl, and the next thing you know, he's back to earth. How many places fire a coach who wins 4 bowl games in 4 years, including a Sugar Bowl? It's wildly dysfunctional from a culture standpoint. I think that's a big part of the problem. I mean, we're not that far removed from Texas being 5-7, suffering that horrible loss to Kansas. They had that losing streak, unlike they'd seen in half a century, to end the season 2 years ago. So they so desperately needed that 8-win season last year, but more so than the 8-win season, an 8-win season with a 49-0 win against Oklahoma. That mattered just as much as the other 7 wins collectively. So here you are, you put yourself in position, you put yourself in a chance. The talent, it's always been there. The recruiting, it's always been there. There's never been a deficit in either one of those categories through all these struggles that you've seen Texas have. Charlie Strong recruited incredibly well his entire time at Oklahoma. Nobody's ever not recruited well at Oklahoma, at Texas. Nobody's not recruited well at Texas. Now, you might see Texas early in the season, who knows? I'm not going to make any predictions, but sneak in and steal one from an Alabama team trying to find its quarterback early in the season. I mean, who really knows? I mean, I'm not going to say that's easy to do against Nick, but you might see that happen. But you also might see that same Texas team turn around and stub its toe in a couple efforts that they shouldn't. I mean, this is a team that over the course of their last 43 games, this is not a team, it's a program that over the course of their last 43 games in one-score games, their last 43 one-score games, they're 18-25. In one-score games. That's a culture issue. They're 4-10 under Sark in one-score games. And until they show that they can win the tight games, because irrespective of how talented you might be, there's other talent elsewhere. There's other solid coaching elsewhere. You're going to find yourself in some tussles. It's not going to be a blowout every week. It's not going to be a layout every week. You're going to have to battle to win these games down the stretch in the fourth quarter. And these are the types of plays that Texas has more often than not fallen short in. That's a culture thing. A lack of culture catches up to you in these tight games down the stretch. If they can't solve the culture piece, they're not going to win these close games. And if they're not going to win these close games, they're not going to turn the corner that they should. The hype that they get every preseason, look, I understand it. It's justified when you look at things on paper. The game's not played on paper. What I have on paper right now is 18-25 as a record in one-score games in the last 43 one-score games. That's what's on paper. These games need played out on the field. And so from a cultural standpoint, they need to solve some of those issues. Now, the pieces are in place, starting with Quinn Ewers, working your way down. Not many teams can lose a Bijan Robinson and still be so attractive offensively. Texas is one of those few teams that can. But can they solve the culture piece and take the next step? We will see, because the talent, it's not going to be short. There's talent at every spot on both sides of the football. From a talent standpoint, they should win this league every year, but they haven't done so in a long, long time. So let's see.
Yeah, on paper, I mean, you could probably say less than 9 wins is a disappointing season. I mean, this is a team that's probably, in most people's eyes, they should be in the Big 12 championship this year. I mean, they've got the experience, they've got the talent at just about every key spot. So how interesting would this be, though, if Sark, like you said, that year 3, if they go 7-5 or 6-6, and it's just an absolute disaster, say he gets fired, and then all of a sudden, boom, transfer portal world, Arch Manning. I mean, what's his future look?
So well, here's one stat I'll throw out there because it's made its rounds in the magazines. It seems to be the stat or the narrative, especially on the defensive side for Texas. I mean, first of all, I think when you look at what they've done defensively, Kwiatkowski has made the most of those pieces that he does have in place, and those are some lovely pieces he has in place. But here's 2 numbers that shouldn't reside in the same world. Texas last year led the entire country in QB pressures with 289. How many sacks do you think they had?
Based on the way you phrased that question, probably not very many.
27, 5th in the Big 12. So they're not finishing those plays. Now, again, I'm not going to dismiss QB pressures. Trust me, I'm an old quarterback. A pressure can sometimes be just as disruptive as the sack. But that's another thing. They need to take that next step and start with these athletes they have, getting there just a tick quack quicker and finishing some of these things and knocking some teams off the field and killing some drives with some sacks instead of some of these pressures, because they're doing a great job of dialing up some crazy looks and getting after the quarterbacks that the offenses don't have answers for. But can they do that? That's just I thought I'd toss that out there because I've seen it 2 or 3 different places, and it seems to be something that the local media in Austin is talking about as well.
Yeah, now a program inside the state of Texas doesn't have quite the expectations of the University of Texas every year, but for some reason, there's a lot of people being attracted to Texas Tech this year. We'll take a look at them here after a quick word from GoMart, here to keep you going. Make sure you're signing up for your GoMart rewards. So let's get to the Red Raiders of Texas Tech. Coach McGuire ushering them to an 8-5 record last season. Really, I think for at least in last season, they surpassed a lot of people's expectations. And that, because of it, they're getting a lot of national attention. Some people think they could be the dark horse to maybe compete for a spot in the Big 12 title game. I don't know if I'm quite ready for that just yet. Tyler Shuck returns at quarterback. He's been dealing with some stuff injury wise, and we saw Donovan Smith at times, who's now at Houston. So there is some changes, but they have a lot coming back, don't they, Jet?
Most experienced team coming back in the Big 12. So, I mean, if you're going to start with giving a team some credit, that's one of the reasons you're going to give them some credit. Preseason by the media, number 4 in the Big 12. This is actually the first time since the Mike Leach days. So you have to go back to the late aughts to find a time that Texas Tech was a preseason pick, even in the top half of the league. So there's a lot of expectations attached to year number 2 under Joey McGuire. He's really got that program believing. I mean, one of the things that has to continue, first of all, the last time they had one quarterback start every game was Patrick Mahomes in 2016. Now, they found ways with a very creative attack to get some things done on the offensive side of the football with 3 different quarterbacks last year. They had 3 different kids throw for 1,000 yards, but I'm quite sure they'd rather have one kid throw for 4,000. So that's the approach they want to take. So they're going to have to keep him upright. I tell you what, when you look at some of the assistant coaches in this league, few did a better job than Zach Kittley running that offense. I mean, he was much heralded coming in. I thought it was a key hire for Joey McGuire. Now, Joey McGuire brought that aggressive mentality that he learned on staff with Matt Rule at Baylor, rolling the dice on 4th down. Nobody goes for it on 4th down more than him. You're often stealing possessions by doing so. It's very up-tempo. It's very aggressive. 84 snaps per game led the country. And, you know, if you're going to do that, you better find a way to get to the quarterback on the defensive side and force some mistakes from the opposing offense. And that's much easier to do with a kid like Tyree Wilson, who's now off to the NFL. First round edge rushers don't grow on trees. But Joey McGuire and that staff seem convinced that by hook or by crook, as a unit, their front 7 might actually be better than it was a year ago. So if you're looking at a shortcoming for this team, they did struggle on the road. They were a 1-4 football team on the road, so they have to take that next step and master that next step. When you leave the friendly confines of Jones Stadium, what can you do on the road? So they come to Morgantown, you know, late in September. And obviously, our struggles with them have been well chronicled. But this team is legit. This team is for real. I mean, I agree with some of the hype, but let's see if they can take that next step. I always say that when you're building a program, part of it is managing expectations. Well, the expectations are certainly there, whereas last year they kind of ambushed some people and they didn't see them coming. The expectations are there. How do you handle that kind of prosperity? I mean, they got hot down the stretch. So when you talk about proof of concept, which I so often talk about with coaches, proof of concept is when what you tell your kids, they see it working on the field and translating into wins, they start to believe and they're picking up what you're putting down. Down the stretch, the Texas Tech Red Raiders were really believing what Joey McGuire and that staff were telling them. They got to the bowl game, they played out there, and they carried that momentum into the spring. There's a lot of buzz in Lubbock surrounding this program. I mean, Joey McGuire, a Texas high school coaching legend, he's beloved down there. He's well connected. They've recruited well. It's all gone according to plan for the first 18 months. Now, let's see how season 2 can go, because is this going to be taking the next step, or is this going to be the honeymoon's about to end? I mean, we'll find out, because a big part of it is how you do manage those expectations.
And the final team that we're actually going to go through and break down here is Central Florida, also the 4th and final member that's newcomer of the Big 12. And Jed, you could maybe even make the argument has the best case to have the most success right out of the gate here, just because of what they have at quarterback and John Reese Plumlee. I mean, this kid is absolutely dynamic. Almost ran for 1,000 yards last year. He threw for another 2,500. They've got some guys coming back at receiver. They lost their top running back, but they do have some depth there. And their secondary, I know they had to retool it a little bit, but they've got some guys in the secondary that can make plays. To me, it's more of a matter of depth, and I'm sure you probably agree with that. But as I told you before we recorded, this team reminds me a lot of West Virginia when they first came into the Big 12. They have an opportunity to get out to a hot start. They have Kent State, Boise State, Villanova to start the year. So there's 3 wins right there, more than likely. And they can get really get on a roll as they get into the conference play. But it's a matter of when they get halfway through the schedule, are they going to hit a wall and just plummet to the face of the earth? Or are they going to be able to overcome some of that adversity?
Yeah, if there is a sleeping giant among the newcomers, I would anticipate this being the closest thing to that. They're sitting there in Orlando. They have a massive student body. They have an up and coming facility on campus. I think they just need a big boy badge from their jersey to go out and recruit with and maximize what they can do right there on the home front in Florida. And they've done a nice job right out of the gates of doing so. Gus has done a nice job. You're going to have a nice plan on the offensive side of the football with Gus Malzahn. That's what you got. You talked about Plumlee. Plumlee is just outright explosive. I mean, this is the type of kid that when he was at Ole Miss before transferring to UCF, when he was at Ole Miss, he faced the number one LSU team in the country and ran for 221 yards on them, number one team in the country. So, yes, he's capable. Yes, he's explosive. As he goes, so go they. In their victories a year ago, 13 touchdowns, just 2 picks, and their losses, just opposite 6 picks, 1 touchdown, couldn't get out of his own way. Now, what they tried to do last year, they came out early and often trying to set the tone on the ground. They ran the football over 150 times in the first quarter, 157 times, among the most in all of college football. Why did they do that? Because they leaned on a veteran offensive line. Herb Hand, shout out to Herb, my old guy from Glenville. He was on staff with Rich at WVU. He's bounced around with some stops at Texas. So he's down there. He's an old Gus guy as well. They were even at Tulsa together years ago. But Herb's coaching the offensive line for Gus down in Orlando, and Herb's done a great job. A year ago, here's a metric I like to look at. It's always interesting to me. When you look at blown blocking assignments on called running plays, they had the fewest missed assignments. Just 4.4% of the time did they have an MA on a called run play in all of college football. So, or in all of Power 5, because they were counting them as the move up to Power 5. So very well coached football team. Now that's the good news. The bad news is Herb's going to have his hands full with a rebuild. They lost 3 critical pieces to that offensive line. They lost the bell cow that was the number 2 in the run game, and Bowser behind Plumlee. But as Plumlee goes, he's a dangerous kid. He's an explosive kid. He can make a lot of problems go away. He's kind of an eraser type player. And the big chatter coming out of Orlando, when you listen to Gus talk, he truly believes that Plumlee has taken the next step as a passer. And if he can develop into a legitimate dual threat, I think that could be a challenge for opposing defenses. And as you talked about, we'll see what kind of things or challenges that they can present on the defensive side of the football. The challenges that they're going to face on the schedule 1 through 12 this year, at least in conference play in those 9 games, might be a little different than the top-heavy American schedule that they played in previous years. So the depth, as you touched on, may in fact catch up to them. Might be one of those teams that you need to scrutinize their schedule, see who they have early, see who they have late. Of course, West Virginia, we got to get down to the bounce house. I fully expect to have our hands full. That's going to be a challenging place to play. I'm looking forward to going there for the first time. Last couple of times West Virginia was in Orlando, we were in the Citrus Bowl, playing in the Citrus Bowl in those bowl games. So, they got the off-campus, the on-campus stadium. Okay, South Florida is heading in that direction. I mean, these Florida schools are starting to get it. They're starting to come up
Took
with
a
some of
little
these
while.
It took a little while, but yeah, I think Central Florida, it could be a burgeoning giant if given time. And given the resources that they'll acquire over the course of time with this Big 12 media deal, they're going to step up in a big way in years to come. It's just how many teams can they surprise and ambush out of the gate in year 1?
Yeah, and then finally, Jed, to wrap up the second part of our Big 12 preview is West Virginia. We're not going to go completely in depth with this because we already had the offensive preview out there with as Jed and Wesley and Owen did earlier. So they did a great job with that. Make sure to go on YouTube and find that in the gun. But Jed, you did say you wanted to get to double back on something. So go ahead and hit that first with the offense.
Yeah, we broke down the offense and we did so thoroughly. I mean, Owen and Wes and I were bantering back and forth, and there was so much to chew on and so much to talk about. The running back room, there's so much to get excited about. we got to see what the answers might look like out of that quarterback room. I mean, I'm not one of these guys who fully anticipates the answer to be found in the next couple of weeks. Maybe it's not. Maybe it takes a little more time than that. It's got to work itself out. If that means work itself out within the context of the first handful of games, that's fine too, so long as we're heading in a productive direction with it. But I think that we're going to lean on the offensive line. I think we got incredible depth at running back, but we got so caught up in talking about those things and even the newfound weapons on the perimeter from a transfer standpoint. I didn't mention the kind of camp that Rodney Gallagher's having. I didn't mention the kind of camp that Traylon Ray's having. So you got a couple true freshmen in that receiver room that are also trying to find a niche and find their role, and they could work their way onto the football field. They've opened some eyes. So hats off to both those kids. But again, on the offensive side, because of the changing coordinators, yeah, I do think that Chad Scott, even though he's not calling the plays, he's going to have a different role from a big picture standpoint. And what I'm hoping is the offense at large has a chance to. There's an infectiousness to Chad's approach to things, and you saw it play out on the field from a production standpoint over the course of the last 4 years with the running back room. I like the idea of expanding that infection beyond that when I talk about infectiousness. So the kids really like it. What he says resonates with a room full of kids. So let's see if that translates to different things on the offensive side of the football. So, but yeah, I wanted to shout out a couple of those newcomers on the perimeter. They got some opportunities to make some plays, as you might expect from a recruiting standpoint. They were much heralded coming in, and they've been up to it so far.
Yeah, they definitely have. I'm really interested, I guess, just to see how all of these pieces mesh, because I mean, really, this is kind of like, at least in my opinion, the first time West Virginia's had this many options at both running back and receiver, and I guess you'd even throw tight end in the mix too. Now that Cole Taylor's there, they got Traylon Davis working in. He's developing as a pass catcher, so they've got options, and it's really a good problem to have. And like you guys mentioned on the show, the offensive preview, they even have a fullback, Luke Hamilton, right? So I
Yeah.
mean, this is just a unique offense, and I'm also interested to see how Neil regains control of the offense now that he's calling the shots once again. He's back into what he's done his whole entire career. And I think it's a good move, especially in a year where you have to win now. Who else would you rather bet your job on than yourself?
Yourself.
So
Yourself. So we
uh,
got to, yeah, we've obviously had an episode where we fleshed out the offense. There's an episode fleshing out the defense as these things unfold and we populate, the stratosphere with our content here. Be sure to, once you're done with this, look those up as well, because we did a lot of research, and when Wes and Owen and I had those conversations or are having those conversations, we got pretty deep with it, and it was pretty fun.
yeah, absolutely. Great stuff from Jed, Owen, and Wesley. Jed, final thoughts here on West Virginia. Maybe West Virginia's stance in this Big 12. Obviously, they're a preseason pick 14th, dead last by the media, but you and I both know that that's probably not true by the end of the year. So, just where do you think this team's ceiling is? Where could that land?
Well, let me hear you give your opinion on
Okay.
the ceiling, and then I kind of want to go from there. Okay.
My ceiling for West Virginia is seventh, I think that's a safe spot. Middle of the pack. Maybe they steal a couple games on the road that they're not expected to win, and they end up somehow in the middle of the pack. I mean, the crucial thing is how they handle coming out of that brutal month of September, where you play 5 games, essentially half your schedule, before you really get into the thickness of the Big 12 schedule. So I would say seventh would be the ceiling, but I would say they're for it to be considered a not disappointing season, right? So about expectations, living up to the expectations, I'd say probably 10th or 11th. Anything below that, I think that's when you start walking in the danger territory. But 10th or 11th, I mean, when you're talking about all the changes they have, you're losing your top 4 receivers. You're losing several pieces of your defensive line and several members of the secondary. I know you're retooling that, but I would say 10th. This is a large turnover for me.
Okay, I'm going to whittle my way down to this. I'm going to start big picture Big 12. When you look at the teams that have played in the Big 12 championship game over the course, the last half dozen Big 12 championship game teams or participants, this came from Pick Six Previews. Their record the following season is 42-30. So they've stumbled. The last 3 years, teams coming out of that have had a hangover and they've stumbled. So that opens the door for other teams to rise up and maybe take part. That's been what's unfolded the last 3 years at the top of the Big 12. They have a hangover and somebody else steps up and replaces them, like a TCU or like a K-State. So when I look at West Virginia, again, I think the strength has to necessarily lie at the point of attack on the offensive side of the football. If this team is going to be any kind of team that's remembered favorably, that does things beyond expectation. I'm not talking about the 14th preseason expectation. Set that aside. I'm talking about doing some things that the team itself wants to accomplish. It's only going to happen if the offensive line develops in what we hope it can develop into. If that happens, there's all kind of possibilities offensively. I think we'll find ourselves a quarterback. I have faith in both answers. The skill set of both those kids bring different things. I love what we have in that running back room and how that even spills out into the perimeter with some of the versatility of some of the kids in that room. I like what we brought in the receiver room. We're not asking these kids to catch 110 balls like Tavon or Stedman. That's not going to be what their role is. So I think what it comes down to is on the defensive side of the football. You talked about the attrition. You talked about the losses. First of all, how does the defensive line answer the bell? There's some possibilities there. There's some candidates there. But I think that we need to help them out by getting creative on the back end, chopping the front up. You don't want to lean on them more than you have to. So that only happens if, when you look at these transfers that we brought in, these established kids that are coming from the G5 level that have shown ball skills and they can play on the football in flight. They have PBUs. They have career interceptions. They're ball hawks. So if you can hit on 2 or 3 of those transfers and they prove to be difference makers in the back end, that translates to what you can do on the front end of your defense, because I do think we'll find answers in that linebacker room. I think there's enough talent. I think there's enough fits with what we're asking those kids to do. But if you find the answers on the back end to help Aubrey Burks, you find the answers at corner, you find the depth that you might need. If some of these transfers can hit, we talked about what TCU did. I'm not saying we're a playoff team, but what TCU did, they hit well in the portal. And they hit well on kids that they didn't have to outbid Alabama and Georgia to get. It was all about out evaluating other schools. So did West Virginia out evaluate other schools and find a couple sleepers in these kids that we're bringing in conjunction with Country Roads Trust, as is necessary, and how that's the course of doing business these days. So if we hit on some of those kids, it makes other things possible defensively, because if you didn't hit on some of those kids, then now you're kind of ducking for cover defensively. And what you got to do is truly find a way to take as much air out of a football game as you can on the offensive side. But I don't think that's going to be the case. If you hit on some of those kids, you might have a different look defensively, and they start believing, they get some swagger, and now you have an offense that's built to help them get rest when they need it. So I think that you could possibly push to the top half of the league if all those things go on. Put yourself in contention, put yourself in some close games in the fourth quarter, and then tip a ball or break a return and see what happens. I mean, I think ideally that's what you're hoping for. That's what you're looking for, but you got to hold serve until you find some of those answers. I mean, as you touched on, that's a brutal stretch, 5 games in September, and specifically who you're playing in those 5 games. There's really one empty chair out of 5 games, and that's Duquesne, right? So you got to find your way. You got to stabilize over a very rough stretch where you're trying to find some answers defensively. You're trying to find your answer behind center or answers and see how that plays out against rugged competition. If you can survive that and push on from there, anything's possible down the stretch, because the worst might be behind you. We'll see.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting few weeks here leading up to the season. That there's some jobs up for grabs. Obviously, quarterback, defensive side. There's the will position, which is probably the most big, or I would say the biggest question mark, because you don't have extra low anymore. They're moving Lance Dixon over to Spear,
Which that interests me too. The Lance Dixon thing. Not to interrupt, Schuyler.
yeah,
We're gonna get heavier to the field, setting the edge against the run. And that kind of excites me, because Lance is an explosive kid. He can move in space too, so he's not a liability in the pass game. But go ahead. I mean, that you just made me think of that, and that's something that I want to keep an eye on. I mean, he's a different body type than what we traditionally had out there at that spot in space against these types of kids, and that again, could be an asset against the run, which is a big part of the reason that we're doing it.
Yeah, I like the outlook of this defense. I mean, and when you look at Jordan Leslie, and again, I won't go too in depth with this because you can catch that on the other episode. But Jordan Leslie has been phenomenal as a defensive coordinator since he's been at West Virginia. And I think you could look at last year as a mixture of things. I think it's more of an anomaly more than anything. You had the injury to Charles Woods, and all of a sudden, you had a lot of questions about where certain guys can play. They're being asked to play certain roles that they probably weren't ready to play at that certain point of the season, and you had guys playing out of position even. So it was just a chaotic mess that they were trying to figure out on the fly. And I think this year they have more answers for those questions if they arise. The secondary, which was atrocious at times last year, and even Neil alluded to it in the press conference a couple of weeks ago, in my opinion, even though those are a lot of new faces in that secondary, you have that experience to count on. Like Anthony Wilson and Beanie Bishop and Keyshawn Cobb and so on and so forth. So I think that secondary is a lot better than it's getting credit for. And if they can step up and show that they are better than what they were a year ago, I think this team can steal a game or two.
That's going to be critical. And again, when you talk about Jordan Leslie as a defensive coordinator, his first year in that role at West Virginia was 2020. Okay,
That's defense.
Well, West Virginia in 2020, with Jordan Leslie as the coordinator, with Jordan Leslie putting the plan together, with Jordan Leslie making the calls defensively, was the first Big 12 team since Kansas State in 1999 to lead the nation in pass defense. Now, did we have 4 first-round picks in the back end defensively that I don't know about, that I forget? I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. So the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. It's not a coaching issue and a coaching issue entirely. Now, the coaches are always looking at ways to improve and find ways to refine themselves and strategize better and come up with some answers they previously didn't have. Jordan Leslie and that staff continue to try and do that. But as you try and plug some holes, because I agree with you, things kind of got out of hand last year and spiraled in the wrong direction. Now, part of that was communication breakdown, which does, that lies at the feet of the staff, right? I mean, defensively, it's you got to get them in position to understand more crisply what they're doing. But so you just hit on some key points there. But when I revisit Jordan's first year as coordinator, look, it wasn't because we got 4, first round picks playing corner, safety. It was a combination of all those things. We had some pretty good players on that back end, okay, but not to the point that it was only talent and talent alone doing that. So let's see how this unfolds with some fresh blood. Now, did the scouting department come through? Did the player personnel department come through? Did we appropriately scout these kids that we targeted in the portal? We're about to find out. To some extent, we already are seeing some of it in camp. Now, when the real bullets fly, let's see what plays out. But that's kind of what, to me, is going to be critical on how this thing turns on the defensive side of the football. If you hit on a couple of those transfers, that's one thing. If you didn't, that's a whole different thing.
It is. And the one thing I do like that they are doing this camp is they're tackling more. They're being more physical. Made it very clear that they're not going to allow that to be an excuse this year, because I mean the tackling in the Pitt game was probably below average, but the Kansas game was horrendous, and that's what honestly probably cost them that game, was their inability to tackle. So,
and even from a special team standpoint, nobody goes live these days from a kick coverage standpoint, but we're even doing some of that for a couple of reasons. First, we got to grow as a kick coverage unit, but second, we want to make sure we got the right guys in place to give us a chance to return some of those things.
Yes. So a lot of good stuff for that. That's it for your Big 12 preview. Again, if you want to check out the in-depth West Virginia offense and defensive preview, go to the YouTube page at In the Gun. Jed, Owen, and Wesley did a really good job of breaking that down for you. One final thank you from Fortis for roof performance and financial security guaranteed. Make sure you visit fortis.us.com. And for Jed Drenning, I'm Schuyler Callihan. And the one thing that we ask of you is to be an ear and tell an ear about your favorite WVU football podcast. And you have been In the Gun.